Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today we're going to be doing a Lightroom tutorial on how you can create those dark, moody, black and white, high contrast images using Lightroom. Now, if you're a Camera Raw user or a Photoshop user, then these things are transferable as it's basically the same software in Camera Raw as it is in Lightroom. So everything we're doing today can be done in Camera Raw. And if you're new to using Lightroom, then it's quite easy. We're just going to be using the masking tools to do everything we're doing today. So with that being said, let's jump into Lightroom and let's take it from this image to this image. So if you like this sort of content or you want to see me out in the field capturing these images, don't forget to like and subscribe. Okay, welcome into Lightroom. So this is the file we're going to be working with today, and this is a file from my last video where I visited Mumble's Lighthouse. I thought they were screaming out for a black and white conversion. This is a nice high contrast, moody edit, and it really has elevated this image. So this really did scream out for this to be done. So we're going to go through a 3-stage process with this, with some tweaks at the end. And that's going to be, firstly, we're going to take control of the exposure. Then we're going to darken down the image in the areas that we want to. And then we're going to lift the image by brightening up the highlights within it using the masking tools. So let me just take you through our original file. So there's our original file, and as you can see, I've not got any edits on this whatsoever apart from 2, and that's lens corrections, and I have done spot removal. I didn't want to put you guys through that. Okay, so let's get into the first part of the edit, which is taking control of the exposure. Okay, let me just check that I don't need to crop. No, I don't need to crop it. I'm happy with that. We have no mask, as you can see. So let's jump into the basic panel. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is adjust my white balance. Now, I shoot everything in daylight mode. I just leave it set to that way things don't change when I'm doing multiple exposures. So I'm going to take that to where I feel it looks like it did on the day, which is about there. And what that has done, if you look in the sky and in the highlights in the sea, it's brought out a bit more of the white, and that was probably more like it looked on the day. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to play with my exposure a bit, see where I want it. So I think I'm just going to tweak that up a touch. Now we do need to keep an eye on our histogram up here, just to make sure we're not clipping anything. I will put on the blinkers. There we go. As you can see, we've got a touch in the blacks there where we've got no detail. There is detail there, it's just not currently showing, but our highlights are all good, so we're not clipping either end. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to drop the highlights. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because I'm going to be boosting the highlights when we get into the 3rd stage. So I want to make sure that I'm not going to be blowing anything out. So I want a nice kind of flat image. So then I'm going to lift the shadows somewhat. There we are. I think around about there. And I'm just going to lift the blacks a touch. In fact, what I'm going to do is set my black point. I think I am actually going to reduce it a bit. Let's have a look at that. So we do that by selecting the slider, holding the Alt key, and then that will, as you slide things, it will show you where you're clipping. So I have a feeling we're going to be around about there. Now the key areas I'm looking at, I'm not too worried about this bottom corner at the moment, are here, because the light's coming in from this side and we do have some light on these rocks, just a bit. Obviously we've got the light on the back island and the light on the middle island. So we need to make sure that that is maintained, but it's not too bright. So that's our whites and our blacks set. In terms of texture clarity, dehaze, I'll not touch that at the minute. So there's our basic panel dealt with. So it's time to move on to stage 2, which is darkening the image in the areas that I want. Okay, so let's move on to the next stage, which is converting this to black and white and then starting our dodging and burning. Now we're going to be doing the burning first. As the name suggests, if you burn something, it will get darker. So that's what we're doing. We're darkening down the image. So let's get into it. So let's do our black and white conversion just by clicking the black and white button there on the basic panel. Okay, so I'm going to close that down to give me a little bit more editing space. I will reopen my basic panel actually. So let's start by darkening down the sky. So we're going to take a linear gradient for that. I'm going to start up at the top and drag it down, and I'm going to pull that so it just covers over the sea. So we are affecting all of the sky. There we go. And we're simply going to drop the exposure on that until this middle ground here is kind of where we want the dark area to be. Somewhere around about there, I'm thinking, to start with. Then we are going to duplicate that and put it on the top, but we're not going to go down so far. So with that mask there, you can just right click, duplicate the mask. There we go. You can see it's laid it over the top, and we're just going to slide that up until it gets where we want it to. I'm thinking somewhere around about there, so we're not affecting the mountain at all. There we go. And then I'm just going to play with the exposure and the shadows. Let's see. Let's reset the exposure and let's see what the shadows do. If we drop the shadows, you can see that we're maintaining some of the brighter areas because they're not being affected so much. Whereas if we drop the exposure, it affects the brighter areas as well. So I think I'm just going to drop the exposure a touch and then do the rest using the shadows. Somewhere around about there. Yeah, I think now it's still not a dark enough sky, to be honest, so I'm going to go back to our first mask. I'm then going to darken that down a touch again, and we are going to lose some of those whites. Let's do it with the shadows a bit, I think. Let's go there and drop the shadows. And as you can see, by using the shadows over the exposure, we are maintaining some of the whites. I think we're going to drop the blacks a touch as well. And that's really going to drop the darker areas and give it some mood. There we go. But what you will notice is that we've affected now the islands and we've affected the sea. So let's intersect that mask by selecting the mask, holding down Alt, and you'll see that the intersect button appears. There we go, you click that and select sky. There we go. And you should see that the island brightens up. There we go. So if I hover over that mask, you can see the area we're now affecting doesn't hit the island and the sea. So there's the sky pretty much roughly where we want it. So let's now do the same for the foreground. So let's place another linear gradient at the bottom of the image. So, linear gradient. I'm going to start this off fairly close to the bottom and stretch this up to about the horizon line. And move that down a touch so it's not too dark in the midground. Stretch that up. There we go. And again, we're going to drop the exposure. As you can see, we are clipping on the right hand side of the big rock, but that's okay around here. Not too worried about that. I'm more interested in this area here to see how that darkens down. So I think I want this area to be around about there. Let's just drop the shadows a touch as well. And that's darkened down in the deeper areas over there. So we've also affected this rock though, and this rock. So we need to bear that in mind. And of course we've got clipping in this section of this rock. So how are we going to deal with that? Let's subtract an object. So all we need to do is remove this from the mask by selecting it and colouring it in. There we go, getting there. And let's see what that does. Okay, so it's removed it from the mask. And there we are. So we've now maintained how that rock looked, but we will be working on that rock a little bit later. And like I said, we've also darkened down these two, but we are going to brighten those back up. Okay, so we're fairly well getting near where I want it for the darker stages of the edit. So let's have a look and see if there's anything else I want to do. I'm just going to brighten up this central section just to give me an idea of what I'm looking at. So again, I'm going to create a mask. I'm going to select object. And I'm just going to draw around that. There we go. And that one there as well. And that should select those two islands. I'm going to use contrast for this. That's it. Around about there. Not too much. There we go. So I think I need to now darken down this right hand side. I'm going to do that with a linear gradient. And I'm going to slightly angle it because the light was coming in from basically over my left shoulder as we're looking at the shot there. So I'm going to drag that over. I'm just going to drop the exposure a touch, and that just darkens down that top left corner and the side and helps to give the impression, well, we've effectively created a vignette through this image by doing so, but we've had greater control over the vignette in terms of how dark we want things. So a touch darker, I think about there. Right, so that's us done darkening the image, I think, for the moment. We're going to come back to it. We are going to tweak things at the end, as I said. So let's get into the dodging side of things now, and let's start to breathe a little bit of life into this. Just before we go, I think I am going to darken down that top section of the image a little bit more because I'm finding it a bit distracting over in the top section where the bright areas are. So let's just go down a touch more. Yeah, there we go. That's that. Right, let's get on to the next stage. Okay, so let's get on to the dodging. Right, before we go any further, let's just have a quick recap of where we came from and where we've got to. So if I turn off the masks, you can see we started there and we've darkened the image down there. Effectively, we've created a vignette style of darkening because the left hand side is that fraction brighter where the light is coming from. So the first thing we're going to do is work on the sky and the sea. So let's start with the sky. Again, let's create another mask. All of this is done basically creating masks. So we've got a nice feathered radial gradient. Now I don't want to affect these bright bits that are just above the mountain there because they will blow out very quickly, but I do want to affect the section above it. So I'm thinking about there, and we'll up the exposure a touch and increase the whites. There we go. I think we can go up a little bit more on the exposure there, give that some pop, like that. Yeah, somewhere around about there, I reckon. My computer is starting to run slow, so apologies for that. I am just going to bring down the blacks a touch to stop that from fading out too much into the blacks. There we go. So the next section we're going to work on is this section of the sea and this section of the sea. Again, we're going to create a radial gradient. I'm going to draw that over this section of the sea. Bearing in mind I don't want to brighten it too close to the edge too much. And we will increase the exposure a touch and increase the whites. I'll give that some nice vibrancy. A touch more on the exposure. There we go. And then we're going to do the same over here. Radial gradient. And we're just going to go fractionally over these rocks and over into this portion of the sea. As you can see, we've got this kind of natural triangle going on in the middle. So I think I'm going to do it like that so we catch the top of those rocks and bring back the light that's on top of them. So let's increase the exposure and increase the whites. And I'll really start to drag some punch in, as you can see. So we've caught the top of those rocks and we've brought in the brightness here. The light is coming from this side, so it's going to naturally be fractionally brighter than this side. Now I want to work on this area of the sea, and we're going to do the same again with a radial gradient. Like that. We're just going to emphasize that a touch just by bringing up the whites. And I have noticed there's a big splodge in the middle of the screen there that'll have to be cloned out. But we'll bring down the blacks as well, because I want to keep a fraction of that shadow detail in there. There we go. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we'll work on this area of the sky because the light is coming from that side and these two rock sets that are down in the bottom section. So let's do the sky first. And we're going to do another radial gradient. This time I'm going to zoom in a touch, zoom out a touch so that I know where I'm drawing it. I'm going to start from approximately the center of the screen. I'm going to go right out to the edge of that rock because it does feather out nicely. open it up and angle it, because that's the light direction. There we go. I might bring that in a little bit more. There we go. And then let's increase the exposure on that. And keep an eye on our histogram up in the corner here, just to make sure we're not clipping anything out. Okay, let's go back to full screen. And there we go. That's really given us some pop. Now I would like to emphasize this section over here just a fraction more with the clouds, because they do come around and darken this little bit here, just a bit of contouring. So I'm going to create a brush for the darkening. And we're going to drop the exposure a touch, and actually we're going to drop the shadows. We'll drop the blacks a little bit. So again, not much flow on the brush. The idea is just to catch the blacks and emphasize the whites. A touch of contouring. So let's see how that's affected things. You are just that smidgen. Just come in a little bit more here. Like that. So we're kind of getting this arcing motion going across the sky. Okay, and I just want to brighten up this section here a little bit more. So let's do that with a brush. I'm going to increase the exposure a touch and just lightly feather that in, because after all that is where the light's coming from, and that is quite dark, like that. So it's kind of giving us a bit of atmosphere over in this section as well as brightening things up. I might just readdress this one here. Just take that down a fraction. Just a fraction. Like that. Right, there we go. So that's the majority of the sky and the sea done. Let's work on this rock here and this rock here, and then finally we'll end up working on the central section, and we're not going to be far off done. Okay, so let's work on this rock down in the bottom corner on the right. So I'm going to start with a brush on this, and I'm going to try and drag out some detail in the top of the rock. So let's get a brush and let's increase the highlights and the whites. I'm going to increase my density a bit on this. There we go. So let's bring that in around about there over the rocky elements. And then I also want to touch just to highlight this brighter patch within this rock, and maybe a little bit there. I think that's good enough. Let's switch that on and off. And that's given that a bit of punch. I want to get rid of this clipping in this area here as well. So we'll do that with a brush. And we'll just increase the blacks to like so. I'll bring down the flow again on my brush, so I'm not too heavy-handed. And we'll just paint that clipping away. Like so. Okay. Looking at it, I could probably raise the whites on the top a bit more. Clipping is still showing a little bit. It's just my computer taking so long to render it. So let's go back to this mask and let's just increase the amount we're doing it, like so. About there. So I think that's enough for that rock. Now, using the same brush, I'm going to come over here and make sure my flow is definitely down. And I'm going to emphasize the bits of light that are on top of this rock and this rock and this rock. So let's zoom in. And just catch the tops of them rocks. Like so. I may put a bit more contrast into these rocks as well. They're the ones that would be catching the light the most. And then just on the tips of this one. So let's switch that on and off. You can just see it's just lifted those rocks a touch. And we do have a bit of clipping over here. So let's get rid of that whilst we're here, we may as well. And there we go. Right, so we've done something to the rocks in the bottom left and in the bottom right. So let's work on this central section now. Okay. Let's make it fit. So I'm going to start with the big rock and I'm going to select an object for that. Like so. And what we're going to do is we're going to emphasize the whites that are within this rock where the light is hitting, because it looks very flat once my computer renders. Okay, so there we are. So I'm going to boost up the whites. I'm going to boost up the highlights on this, like so. But then we're going to intersect this with a brush. And we're going to contour that in. So let's zoom in a touch, like so. Now you'll notice it's all washed out at the minute, but as soon as I start painting in with this brush, it will then start to only highlight the bits I'm painting in. So the idea is to actually be a little bit loose with it. Let's go a bit larger on the brush. We can't go over the edges of the rock because we've selected the object and we're only painting within this object. So we can be, like I said, a little bit loose with this. Let's do that one. I think we need to add a bit more punch into this. And we're painting over the rocky areas that are nice and bright. Let's go a bit smaller and let's highlight this beach. And we'll do a little bit. Let's turn the flow down. There we go. On this grey area, like that. And let's do over here. Because my flow is so low, it takes quite a few strokes to paint it in, but it also means that you can reduce the amount of strokes that you want to brighten it up. That way you can have darker and lighter areas. So this area definitely needs a bit more. and the highlights on top of the grass. Could do with a bit as well. Let's come over here because this would be quite bright. Okay, so let's have a look at what we've done. So we've considerably lifted the whiter areas. If I come out, there we go. I think we could possibly do with a little bit on that island, because that's looking a bit washed out. Okay, right, let's have a look at what that's done then. As you can see, we've dramatically lifted that. Now we need to work on this island. We will come back to them in a second on, in fact, let's have a look now. So this is one of the original masks we made for it. This was during the darkening process. I really want to increase that contrast a bit, I think. Somewhere around about there, that'll do. So let's go back up and let's create a mask for the island at the back. Again, we're selecting an object. Okay, it's done a pretty good job. That bit wants to come off there. Let's subtract that. There we go, we're removing that from what we're doing. I think the exposure needs to come up a touch. There, and then we'll just increase the blacks on that. Give a bit of contrast. And we'll add a little bit more contrast into that. Just a touch. There we go. Right, so we're fairly well there, to be honest. This isn't far off. It does need tweaking, but what I am going to do now is I'm going to go away and make myself a cup of tea, because I want my eyes to rest away from this for 5 minutes. Then I can come back and have a look and see what needs adjusting. So this is quite an important element of doing the edit. Guarantee you your eyes are going to settle into the image far too much, and then you're going to just come back a few days later and you're going to go, ooh, hang on a minute, that's not right. So if you do it now, then yeah, it's the perfect time to do it. Let's get a cup of tea. Okay, cheers guys. Right, so I've had a quick break and I've had a quick look at the image when I came back. I've jotted down some things I want to do. So the right hand side of the image in the water is too bright. The left hand edge is a bit too bright, just close to the edge. The lighthouse is definitely too bright, and I need some more contrast in the main island and in the foreground water where the pebbles are showing through. So that's what we're going to address. Let's get on with that then. Okay, so firstly, let's have a look at this right hand edge. So as you can see, my computer is running really slow. So if this video does chop and change, that's the reason why. So I'm going to just drop the exposure a fraction. Leave the whites up so we've got that pop. Just take them down a bit. There we go. So that's kind of where I'm thinking. And next we'll address this left hand edge, which I think is coming from this mask here. So I think I'm going to just shorten it a touch, and then I'm going to bring it in. So something like that, just so that that right hand edge isn't so bright. I think that needs to lift a touch as well. Okay, so next let's sort the lighthouse out. Now we are going to create a mask for that, so I'm going to zoom into 100%. There we go. As you can see, it's just a bit washed out, so we'll select an object. Okay, there we go. I'm just going to take some of the whites out and add in some black to give it that bit of contrast and definition. And somewhere around about there, I think. I might just bring them whites back a bit. There we go. So we've added contrast into the lighthouse just to give it that bit of definition. Let's just check that. Yeah, there we go. That looks better. And so that's the lighthouse done. What was next? So more contrast in the main island and this area down here. So let's start with this area down here and let's see what masks we're using. So I want to work with this one. So again, I am going to up the whites, possibly the exposure, just to, that's too far, somewhere around about there, I think. So let's come up and let's come over and then just reposition that slightly like so, and just drop those whites down a little bit. Yes, I think about there. I think that looks pretty good. Right, so we now need to work on the island. Tell what we'll do. We're going to create another mask, select the island, and then we're going to put contrast in. So object. Well, I'll tell you what we'll do with this. We'll go to the tone curve for it. So what I want to do is I want to drop the middle tones a touch, middle blacks. I want to raise the white areas. There we go. I think that's slightly too much on the blacks, so I'm just going to lift them a bit. There. Come on, up you come. Let's add another little bit for the higher whites. Something like that. Let's see what that looks like. So that looks a bit more washed out, and that's got a bit more contrast in it. I would like to see a touch more in the higher whites, so let's just play with that. In fact, those blacks are coming up a touch, I think. Somewhere around about there. Now we can play with the amount on this, so I think I'm just going to drop that down a touch. There we go, 90% of what I've done. Just like that. Okay, so that leaves me with one more thing to do, and that's clone out that blob in the middle of the image. That is much better. And there we go, guys. So if you like this sort of content, or you want to see me out in the field capturing these images, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next one.